we're kicking off a new teaching series that we're calling Neighboring. And the big idea behind it is just simply this. There's going to be one question that kind of guides all of our messages. And that one question is this: how do we neighbor well? Right? As followers of Jesus, how do we neighbor well? And we're going to do something a little bit differently. We're going to kick this off a little bit differently. We are going to preach together. We're going to see how this goes.
Sermons will be twice as long, guys. Just kidding. Just buckle up. Here we go. So to get us started into our neighboring series, we wanted to play a little bit of trivia. And so everybody knows that classic trivia game, Name That Famous Neighbor, right?
Oh, classic. Yeah. Played it last night.
Yeah, you guys all have played it, right?
No.
Okay. So here's how it works. I'm going to give Adam clues. Some of them are objects.
Okay.
Some of them are going to be verbal clues. Okay. And I'm going to be honest with you, he's not really great at it. So don't ruin it for him. Hey, we had taught a Bible class on truth and grace. And if he's struggling a lot, give him grace and throw out the answer. You ready?
I think so.
All right. Here is the first.
I don't like where this is going.
It is so tempting. It's so
gross.
I'm gonna have to clean that up later. All right. So the first clue is silly string.
I have no neighbors that I know of in my neighborhood that shoots silly string.
That's because you have boring neighbors, but your kids know the answer for sure. What do you guys think it is? That's right, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
That makes a lot of sense.
All right, okay,
Yeah.
You ready for the next one?
Good neighbor.
All right, now this goes way back. Okay, You ready? Here we go.
What are you doing? I cannot see you. I still can't see you.
Is that better?
That's Wilson. Wilson from Home Depot. From Home Improvement. Wilson from Home Improvement.
There you go.
Heidi-ho, neighbor.
Heidi-ho, neighbor. All right. Let's see here. This one everyone is going to get. Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, 3, boom.
75% of all men wear khaki pants. You are wearing khaki pants.
So are you.
I am wearing khaki pants.
But we're not a famous neighbor. I'll give you one more clue. It'll give it away. Or it should. You ready for this? Here we go. Red polo.
That's Jake. Jake from State Farm.
That's right. Like a good neighbor?
State Farm is...
Oh, you guys are good.
Well, some of you sung it. I appreciate that. Jake picks up my calls all the time.
On this one, this is probably the most famous neighbor of all.
Okay.
And I'm just going to give you verbal clues, okay?
Okay.
So first one is this.
Yeah.
He has neighbors over almost every single day.
Yeah, that's the President of the United States. Like basketball teams go to visit him.
Yeah, but they don't actually go into, like, the residence.
Oh.
They just go visit the White House.
Okay.
Okay? So, no, it's not the president. So he has visitors over. And every time visitors and guests, neighbors come over, they feed fish together.
That is Randy from the Cincinnati Zoo. Have you ever met him?
I've not met Randy.
You haven't met?
No. Have you all met Randy?
Randy, do you remember?
Not
Thank
one
you.
person. He is not a famous neighbor. Okay, he has a traffic light in his living room.
Tony Stewart from Columbus. Tony Stewart from Columbus.
He is a famous neighbor.
I bet you he has one.
He is a famous neighbor. Raise your hand. Don't yell it out because Adam still hasn't figured it out. Raise your hand if you think you got it. All right. It's okay. So let's go ahead and jump, since you're struggling, to this clue. Lindsay's going to help us out with this.
Lindsay?
Hit it, Lindsay.
Oh, of course. Would you be mine?
Would
you be mine? That is not the right tone.
That's why we don't let you sing.
You look good in a cardigan.
You like that?
You look good.
I can't believe this is Daniel.
This is Mr. Rogers, right?
Yes,
okay,
absolutely.
Thank you.
Mr. Rogers is that famous neighbor. And here's the thing. We're talking about neighboring.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because you look at all these famous neighbors, right, guys? You've got Spider-Man, who goes into the neighborhood and he saves the day for all of his neighborhood in New York, right? And then you've got Wilson. And Wilson gives the absolute greatest advice to his neighbor. And it always seems to pan out well for Tim and Jill when Isn't that funny? Tim and Jill, that's Tim, the Toolman Taylor's wife. That's awesome.
Are you talking about Pastor Tim?
No.
Maybe he is Tim.
Whatever
Toolman
it
Taylor.
plays out. And then Jake, the State Farm, is always there when you call.
Yeah.
24/7, he picks up. And of course, Mr. Rogers would give the cardigan off his back for anybody. So I'm going to go ahead and take this off. These famous neighbors tell us a little bit about what neighboring looks like and perhaps even what it means to be a good neighbor. But why should we here in the church, Adam, spend any significant time dealing with this topic of neighboring if we can turn that word into a verb?
No, I think it's a really good question. And I think, like most answers, the answer lies in Jesus. Because Jesus actually spends a significant amount of time talking about neighboring, right? There's a time when the teacher of the law came to visit Jesus. And the teacher of the law had one question. He said, summarize all of the law for me. I know that I've spent most of my life studying the law, but you, Jesus, you be the one to summarize the law. Now, Pastor, I don't know about you, but I'd have a really hard time summarizing 1,052 pages that's found in the Old Testament. Okay? I couldn't do it. I could barely preach a 20-minute sermon, let alone one sentence. But Jesus is the Word of God, so he summarizes the Word of God quite well. And Jesus starts off with this. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And this is a really important move that Jesus does, a really important teaching for us, because Jesus starts this teaching in a common confession of faith. Much like we have the Apostles' Creed, right? And we have the Nicene Creed, the Old Testament people had something called hey, Pastor, you want a $5 word to drop on your family at brunch?
I would love a $5 word, but even better if it's in Greek or Hebrew.
How about Hebrew?
Hebrew's great.
Hebrew. So there's a $5 word. It's called the Shema. If you drop this to your friends, they're going to know that you're in church and you're going to look good. The Shema is kind of the Apostles' Creed or Nicene Creed of the Old Testament. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is the common confession of faith. And this is important because Jesus starts the teaching with a confession of faith, because everything starts with faith. And Jesus then kind of launches into his famous teaching. He has 4 things, right? He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength, which is just a churchy way of saying, love Jesus with everything you got, right? Love God with everything you got. I think at this point in time, Jesus took a quick pause because the teacher of the law might have thought that at this point in time, Jesus had finished his summation of the law, right? They said, hey, give me a quick sentence to summarize the law. There it is. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. But Jesus doesn't just give us one sentence. He gives us 2, right? He continues the teaching, and he says, love your neighbor as yourself. And those 2 together, without separation, gives us a purpose statement, if you will, right? What is the church to be about? What is the church to do? What are you as followers of Jesus to be about? What are you to do? As you have breath in your lungs, what are you to be about? What are you to do? You are to love God and love neighbor. That is our purpose in this life. But I think the application of this gets a little tricky, right? I think the church has done a good job of teaching how to love God, right? Come to worship, receive the gifts that Jesus freely gives to you. That's worship, right? Center yourself on God's word in your family, in Bible study, right? In your own devotions. But when you flip the proverbial coin, or get on the other side of Wilson's fence, if you will, right? I think the application of loving neighbor is a little more difficult, right? How do we love our neighbor when we mow 3 times before they even think about mowing once, right? How do we love our neighbor when they cross property lines all the time, right? How do we love our neighbor when really all my neighbor does is yell at my kids, right? How do we love our neighbor when all our neighbors does is just they get back from work, they go into the garage, they close the garage door even before we can even get a hello in? I think this idea of how to neighbor well is tricky. Or maybe to put it this way, how can we be a biblical neighbor?
Yeah, and that term right there, guys, biblical neighbor, I think a lot of times when we think about neighbor, we have kind of this idea of an HOA neighbor, right? Somebody who's just generally a great person and easy to live by. But I think the idea of a biblical neighbor, as Adam laid out, is actually a little deeper than that, and I hope it would be. I think the way that, maybe Mr. Rogers or Spider-Man or even Wilson defines neighbor is remarkably different than the way that Jesus would define neighbor for us.
I think so, right? I think Mr. Rogers does define neighbor differently than what the Bible does, how Jesus does. Now, before we dig deeper into that, and because neighboring is really all about bringing people together, you received, when you walked in, or in the center of your pew, is a card. So if you can be a good neighbor, those people sitting in the center of the pew, grab those and hand them down. And those cards have 2 sides to them. One side, there's a question. That question is,
what does it mean to be a good neighbor?
We want you guys to actually take time right now to think about that. In your life, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? What does that look like for you? But that's not the only thing that we have.
Yeah, and adults, as you guys are writing it on your card, kids, we have an activity for you. So we're going to invite all of our kids to come down. We're going to have some paper over here by the band, and we're going to have some paper over here in this corner. And we're going to ask you guys to draw for us or to write out, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? Does it mean to be kind? What does that look like? Is it like playing soccer together in the backyard, mowing each other's lawns, whatever? It's fun to watch them draw and to be able to sit and talk with them about their neighborhoods. You learn so much. And the reality is, we all live in different neighborhoods. We all live in these communities together. And when we think about what it means to be a good neighbor, like I said earlier, we often go to that HOA type, definition. We want the person living adjacent to us, right next to us, to be respectful and responsible. And have you ever had the neighbor who parties until 3 a.m. and you're like, dude, I just want to go to sleep? Or maybe it's New Year's and they think like New Year's runs from 11 p.m. till 3 a.m. and they're just shooting fireworks. You're like, oh, this is not a good neighbor, right? You want somebody to take care of their house and their grass so like property values stay up, all that kind of stuff. We want neighbors who are honest and trustworthy. When you go out of town, do you ever tell your neighbor, hey, we're going to be gone for 4 days. Can you keep an eye on your house? And you just hope that like they don't break in and take everything you have and be like, we don't know what happened, but look at our brand new TV. You want a neighbor who you can trust. You want a neighbor who you can turn to when you have needs. And all these attributes are great for the person living next to us. But here's the thing, like I said earlier, Jesus' definition of neighbor goes far beyond that. Because when Jesus calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves, to be good neighbors, what he's calling us to do is 3 things. He's calling us to show mercy, he's calling us to show forgiveness, and he's calling us to show up in others' lives. And what we see in Jesus is exactly this. Jesus is kind of the absolute greatest neighbor for us because he does show us mercy and forgiveness, and he does it by showing up in our lives. Jesus, the God of all creation, became incarnate, took on flesh and blood to dwell among us, to live among us. And not just to hang out, which is really great. I hope you hang out with your neighbors. But Jesus came to do something very specific. And that's to die for you. Jesus came and he laid down his life for you so that you and I could experience the fullness of God's mercy and God's forgiveness. See, Jesus doesn't show up in our lives just to have a good time. He doesn't show up just to have a nice barbecue. He shows up to do the absolute most profound act of love for someone. Jesus shows up to be forsaken by God so that you and I can be loved by God. See, Jesus is a neighbor to us sacrificially, and not just a neighbor, but he does this so that you and I become more than just a neighbor. Actually, we become family. He brings us into the family of God that you and I would be called dearly loved and forgiven children of God. And when we hear the words of Jesus to love our neighbor as ourselves, to go and be a good neighbor, here's the thing. Our ability to do that doesn't come because, gosh, Pastor John and Pastor Adam or any of us are just great, wonderful people. The ability to truly live out what it means to be a neighbor biblically flows from our experience of mercy and forgiveness. It flows from our experience of God showing up in our life in unexpected ways, our experience of God showing up in our lives in the moments where we need him the most. You see, I once heard a pastor say this: only a God rich in mercy would conceive a plan to save and redeem such wicked creatures like you and me. Here's the thing, when people like you and me experience the fullness of God's mercy and forgiveness, when we experience God's presence in our lives, it does something to us. It moves our hearts, it moves our lives, it moves our minds, and it compels us to not just kind of sit on our haunches, but actually to do what God has called us to do, to show that mercy, show forgiveness, and to show up in other people's lives.
I love what you said, Pastor. You said Jesus didn't just come to the world to show up, if you will. He didn't come to the world just to be at the barbecues. Good food. Didn't come to the world just to be at pool parties, right? Didn't come to the world just to hang out in our basements. Jesus came for a specific purpose, right? And if we as neighbors, if we just show up, we're missing 2/3 of what it means to be a really good neighbor, which means that when we read Mark 12, we realize that being a good neighbor, it starts with Jesus. And I think that's the difference between the way that Mr. Rogers looks at being a neighbor and the way that the Bible looks at being a neighbor, is that for us, it doesn't start with us. It starts with Jesus.
It does, absolutely. And, you know, it's hard for us to kind of live out, I think, the challenges of being that neighbor. And as I have sat and I've thought about it, as we prepared for this series, we talked a lot about, like, what are some of the challenges that we face when it comes to actually being a good neighbor as Christ calls us to. And the things that I started thinking about in my own life, the challenges that rise up. The first one's a little bit shallow, but I'm going to trust you guys not to judge me for a second, right? Inconvenience is a challenge in my life to be a good neighbor. I've got a busy life. We've got 2 kids in soccer 3 times a week. We got 1 kid in gymnastics, another in high school, another in college. We both work. We're going 99 miles an hour all the time. And I just want to kind of get into my groove and do my thing. And it's quite honestly inconvenient to step out of that groove and to go and to show up in my neighbors' lives. Whoever that neighbor may be, it's inconvenient. And I think to build on that, to show up and to show mercy and to show forgiveness, guys, it's about sacrifice. And sacrifice is genuinely hard. When God calls us to be a neighbor, it's not just to hang out and do barbecues. It's part of that. But it really is to sacrifice and embrace a life and a heart of sacrifice for other people.
And what I love about that is that if you're killing it as a neighbor, like everybody wants to move next to you, right? If you're a mediocre neighbor, if you have people and you're causing people to move away from you, right? That is, if you're a terrible neighbor, right? We've all been there. Jesus walks with you and continues to work through you. It reminds me of Maundy Thursday, right? That very intimate moment where in the Gospel of John, Jesus washes the disciples' feet, right? Talk about inconvenient. Yeah. Talk about a sacrifice. But Jesus says this in John chapter 15, verse 13. He says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend. Right? I look at this and I say, Jesus was very inconvenienced by ending his life. Right? Maybe I can inconvenience myself and walk across the street, right? But the blow your mind part, I think, of all of this comes in his very next words. He says, you, talking to his disciples, talking to us, you are my friend.
And guys, if you walk away today with anything, it's that right there, what Pastor Adam just said. God calls you friend. No matter where you've been, no matter where you're at, no matter where you're going, God calls you in Jesus Christ his friend. That is the most profound thing that we've said today. You know, as we look forward into our series over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be diving in deeper to the idea of showing mercy, showing forgiveness, and showing up in others' lives. We want to help you guys, and we're going to join you in this, engage more in being a great neighbor. And in order to do that, we kind of invented or came up with a game. So if you flip your card over to the other side, you're going to see something that looks a little bit like a bingo card. And like I said, this is a game, but it's a challenge to you guys to get to know those that live maybe adjacent to you or around you, or those that you do life with, but man, you just don't know that person's name. One of the most important things about being a great neighbor is making it personal and getting to know their names. A funny story, one of my neighbors from the past, she had lived in the house for about 3 or 4 years, and her next door neighbor on the other side, for 3 years, she knew the wife as Tina. On the very last day that our friends were moving out, that family came over to say goodbye, and she said, Tina, it's been so great to know you. And she looked at my neighbor and said, my name is Tony. For 3 years, she had called her the wrong name. They leave, and my friend looks at Melissa and I and goes, well, maybe that's why we don't talk so much, right? It's important because it's personal to that individual. And so what we want you to do is begin over the next 3 or 4 weeks to fill out the bingo card with those neighbors around you and their names. Maybe this is going to make you get a little inconvenient. You might have to sacrifice some time and put in some effort to cross the street, go 40 feet or 60 feet and knock on a door, or find a good way to connect with the people that you live by. But our hope and goal is that by the time we're done with this series, Neighboring, you'll have filled this card out. So put it on your fridge, hang on to it, keep filling it out. As we wrap up today, we're going to show you just a really short clip from a guy named Bob Goff. You're going to love Bob's heart, you're going to love his laugh, and you're going to love his short message.
What I found in my life is that it's not the random thing that I go somewhere far away to do. It's an idea that's adjacent to one that's already working on. And I think that idea of Jesus saying, like, love your neighbor, love the person that's adjacent to you. Yeah. Like somebody that you share a border with, just love that person. And it sounds noble to go across an ocean. but it sounds scriptural to go across the street.
Yeah.
And so to do that, and then what you find the neatest things when you look at what's adjacent, all of a sudden you make new friends.
Hey, Mr. Ed.